This video is an introduction to the Drought Stripes tool, which is a web tool in the Climate Toolbox used to view past droughts at a location. This tool can be found at climatetoolbox.org and is shown on the screen. This tool was created by Catherine Hegevish and John Abatzoglu at the University of California, Merced, with funding support from NIDIS and CERC, the Northwest NOAA RESA.
And a motivation for this tool is the Climate Stripes or Warming Stripes by Edward Hawkins, which we're at this point we're probably all very familiar with, which shows how the average temperature has been changing for a location from 1950 to present, with a series of colored lines for each year, where blues are the cooler years and reds are the warmer years with respect to a reference period. Um, so similarly, the drought stripes, which are shown here, are also location specific and are a series of colored lines for each year, showing which years are drier or wetter than normal, with reds being the drier years and blues being the wetter years. So here's what goes on, into our drought stripes. First, we start with a location. In the contiguous USA, we have data that is on 4-kilometer grid cells, and so we're extracting data from that. And we'll just take Portland, Oregon as an example. And next, since there are many different types of drought, depending on the nature of the deficit in water, we need to choose a definition for drought. And the easiest to understand here for this presentation is to choose precipitation, representing a meteorological drought. And for these stripes, we are using daily precipitation data from the GridMet observational data set from 1979 up until yesterday. And then since for precipitation, we can look at precipitation totals from weeks up to years, we need to decide on a time scale for adding up the precipitation. This will give us information on short versus long-term drought. And here we'll just choose 6 months so that we're calculating 6-month precipitation totals, which is still looking at relatively short-term droughts. Also, to create these drought stripes, we'll need a way to calculate deviations from average, where here the average is the whites, and these are deviations. So we choose to use the Standardized Precipitation Index, or SPI, which is a way to look at deviations from average, but it's standardized or normalized with um, Yep, and so with a time scale of 6 months, this is also called a 6-month SPI. And SPI is like a z-score in that it is in units of standard deviations from the mean. The sign of SPI tells us if the 6-month precipitations are above or below normal. And the magnitude of SPI gives us the size of the deficit or the size of the surplus in current precipitation totals from average. And then finally, for the drought stripes here, we choose the colors of the stripes, and we're actually choosing them to be consistent with the very well-known US Drought Monitor. And specifically, we use the same categories as the US Drought Monitor to map the standardized indices, the z-scores here, to colors and drought categories. So drought categories, SPI less than -2 or less than 2 standard deviations from the mean is an exceptional drought and is in D4, the drought category. And we're using the drought categories from the US Drought Monitor, and we're also extending those categories symmetrically so that we can represent the wet side of precipitation as well. And so these are our mappings for the SPI values to both drought categories and colors for the drought stripes. And in the tool, we actually have several options for drought metrics and timescales other than just the 6-month precipitation. You can create drought stripes using precipitation or potential evapotranspiration. We can also use it creating the climatic water balance, which is the difference between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, and is more like the usable water. And coming soon to the Drought Stripes tool is we'll have total runoff in the tool as well. And so this will allow the tool to represent potentially 4 different types of drought, from meteorological to hydrological drought here, where standardized indices are used for each of the variables in the tool. And for the timescales in the tool, you can choose from short-term drought timescales of 2 weeks, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, and long-term drought timescales of 9 months, 12 months, 2 years, and 5 years. So yeah, and and then in the tool, you can generate a single, there's 3 things that you can generate. You can generate a single stripe for a single time scale. So here is just 6-month SPI, or you can stack the stripes on top of each other with increasing time scales. So we have individual drought stripes here, and then we're stacking, we're looking at the time scales representing past 1 month precipitation or 3 months precipitation up to 2 years here. Um, and then you can also look at generate a bar chart as a time slice just down the center of the stripes, a time slice to see how the current conditions or the conditions on a specific date decompose into the different time scales. And these visuals can be used to understand a location's drought intensity, duration, and frequency. So as an example of looking at drought intensity, we can look at a single drought stripe of 1-year precipitation totals through SPI for Leavenworth, Washington from 1980 to 2021. And we see here that in 2001, there was an exceptional drought, exceptional meteorological drought here in this dark red, and it was seen in low precipitations from October to March, which caused a whole host of impacts from low stream flows to diminished hydropower and fish kills. And then right after that, it was followed by a moderately wet period where there was a lot of flooding in this time period. And there was a lot of severe damage from the flooding along the rivers from that time period. So this was just an interesting case of drought followed directly by flooding in a single year where both had big impacts. As an example of looking at drought duration, we can ask how long big droughts have lasted in Spokane, Washington. We can stack the drought stripes of SPI for Spokane, similarly from 1980 to 2021, with increasing timescales, where for SPI, these timescales represent precipitation totals for the last half month, for the last 1 month, up to the last year. And in the visual, we can easily see the cycles of drought and wet periods through those forward slanted lines of the same red or blue color. So for example, here you can see these blue wet periods, very strong wet periods, and also these red periods, drought periods in the red lines. And you can see here for looking at drought duration that in 2007, there was an extreme drought seen by this bright red forward advancing line here, and it advanced up until the 2-year time scale, but there is not a red here up here in the 5-year time scale. So their duration is somewhere between 2 and 5 years, and depending on the drought you're looking at, this is a way to look at the drought duration. If we had more timescales between 2 and 5, we would of course be able to get better resolution on this. But that's a way to look at drought duration. And then as an example of looking at drought frequency, we can use those same drought stripes for SPI for Spokane to instead ask how often big droughts have really been happening in Spokane, Washington. This is something that the drought stripes are good for looking at because a region might be in drought, but you might not have a recollection of the history of a location to know like how often this really has happened and for a drought to be that extreme. So here, we don't have a lot of data. We only have from 1980 to 2021, so we can't say a lot about drought frequency. However, we could identify some extreme droughts over the years with these red lines and tally how many there are per decade. And so here I've just eyeballed real quickly the big droughts that are extreme to exceptional. And in the time period from 1980 to 2000, I identified like 4 of them. And then from 2000 to 2021, I identified like 11 of them. And so from this, we might just generally say that extreme drought years look to be doubling in frequency. But this is just an example of the kind of thing that you can do with this tool. So here again, we see the interface for the Drought Stripes tool showing you where you can set the location, showing you where you can set the drought metrics, where you can click on and off the different timescales to add them to the drought stripes and to stack them. Um, you can also zoom in on by changing the year range. And then in this section here, you can look at a time slice of the drought stripes by setting the date that you want to look at and seeing how the drought or wet periods are for that location at that time in the different time scales. So that's it for my presentation. In summary, I just want to say the Drought Stripes tool helps depict past wet and dry locations for a location as a time series of colors. It can be customized for a location, for a type of drought, and for short or long-term droughts timescales. And it uses the same thresholds and colors as the U.S. Drought Monitor. And it can be used to explore the past drought intensity, duration, and frequency of a location. And you can find it at climatetoolbox.org. Thank you.